President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to reshuffle his cabinet in the next few days, with Paul Mashatile said to be the country's second in command. That's after David Mabuza announced at the weekend that he's resigned as deputy president. Let's get your insights now into the duties of the deputy president of this country. Bring in Reverend Frank Chikane, who's the Director General in the Presidency, joining us via our video link this morning. Reverend Chikane, great to see you as always. Thanks very much indeed for making time to speak to us. I wonder if you and I can begin by just unpacking the optics of this moment. So much being said about how David Mabuza essentially made his resignation known. He spoke at a private funeral. We know that. His supporters are saying that this is inconsequential. However, those who are critical of that move are suggesting that, for instance, he went ahead of the president. Are we even asking the right questions insofar as this is concerned?
No. I think this is just a media debate and people expressing themselves about things. But I mean, they are of no consequence whatsoever. The president appoints cabinet, including the deputy president, and can release them of their duties and appoint others as he deems necessary. And so the best way is to wait for the president. I don't think there's another way in which to interpret this. I mean, I've been listening to all the speculations. Only the president can appoint. And when the time comes, I'm sure he'll do that.
Yeah. Surely something ought to be said, though, about the fact that the horse has already bolted in this case. You know, as you've mentioned, there's a lot of commentary in the commentariat, and there are suggestions that the continued silence isn't helping either.
Yeah, no. I think, this is a democracy, and I'm sure the media is exercising its right and people to speculate, etc. There's no horse that has bolted because the president has not appointed. I've handled these matters before. Until the president makes the decision, there is no cabinet reshuffle. Until the president makes a decision, there's no appointment. That is, people can speculate. I think there's lots of pressure. It's almost like people want to pressurize the president to do the appointment quickly, just for interest's sake, maybe for a newsworthy story. But the president makes the appointments at the right time. There have been changes at a party level. But remember that those changes, you could have an election of the party and only make the changes at the national election 18 months later, like it happened with Mandela and Mbeki. He was elected president back in Mafikeng 18 months or so before the end of the term of Mr. Mandela and remained until the next election. So there's nothing that says if the party changes, people necessarily cabinet will change. Indeed, if you are Secretary General and you are full-time at the party, there has to be change. You can't continue doing the two things here.
What's to be said, though, about how much time the president can reasonably be given to fill vacancies in cabinet?
There is no specification. Remember that, it's a configuration of cabinet. President can, if a position is vacant, can appoint another minister to act on behalf of that minister. And therefore, there could be no crisis. Actually, there's no moment at which there would not be a minister acting on behalf of another if the minister is not able to execute his or her duties. And so it's completely in the discretion of the president, actually. There's no constitutional problem here, in my view.
Sure. What can be spoken about, though, surely, is perhaps what it takes to be the deputy president of this country, especially because David Mabuza himself has spoken about his intention at the very least, even though we do know this is the prerogative of ultimately the president, whether or not he decides, he goes and at which stage that actually happens. Given David Mabuza's own track record in that office, what do you reckon would be important to consider for his successor?
Yeah, no. I don't want to pass judgment on cabinet members at this stage. The only thing I can say is that the constitution is very clear. The president appoints the deputy president and cabinet ministers and indicates the responsibilities of those ministers, including the deputy president, in section 92 of the Constitution. And in 96, it talks about the conduct of cabinet members and deputy ministers. And so it gives ministers functions, and including the deputy president and the ministers. But the deputy president in particular assists the president in section 9.15, assists the president in the execution of the functions of government. Remember, the president is a head of state and it's a head of government. And so the deputy president assists the president. And I would imagine when the president appoints a deputy president, it has to be a person who can execute those responsibilities.
Yeah. There's also been a lot said about the alignment of what takes place at a party level and also what takes place at a state level. I mean, whether or not we decide to speak about it, that's just the reality in our country. There is a dominant organization in the form of the ANC. If history is anything to go by, the top leaders of the ANC typically are the top leaders in the country. And in some ways, you know, I suppose there's going to be a lot of pressure to ensure that that alignment continues if there's going to be that smooth transition that's been spoken about in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you would work more on tradition rather than the Constitution. But the president could actually appoint anybody. Could appoint anybody who's a member of parliament to be the deputy president of the country. Indeed, even the president is elected by parliament, so it's not necessarily an election by a party. Parliament exercises its responsibility and rights, and the president comes from the majority party simply because they are in the majority in parliament. But you could actually have a different configuration where, like in these coalitions in municipalities, where a person from a minority party becomes the president of the country. It's very possible. Where the members of the majority party, or they don't have absolute majority, would decide, let's elect another person. So that then follows that the president then appoints. If the president belonged to another party, it could have been any other member of parliament. And you'll also remember that the president has got the right to appoint two ministers who are not necessarily members of his party, and can appoint two deputy ministers who are not necessarily members of the party. So I think the Constitution stands on its own, irrespective of what happens at the party level. Yeah,
there's what the Constitution says, and there's what different people draw from that. In other words, there's interpretation. Yes, on paper, there very well could be the possibility that anybody in cabinet could be the deputy president, but I don't imagine you're saying you see a situation where that actually takes place in the coming days.
Well, can I leave that to the president himself? But I'm just explaining how the Constitution functions. It doesn't matter what happens at the party level. So what the party does not prescribe how the Constitution is actualized. And so the dynamics, indeed, you have to observe what's happening. If you are a deputy president in the ANC, you are likely to be deputy president in the country. But, you know, I mean, there's a time when I remember in history when I think it was President Mbeki wanted to appoint Mr. Buthelezi, you know, to be deputy president. And, of course, there were negotiations with the ANC in KwaZulu-Natal. It couldn't work. So it is possible. You could actually do a thing like that. Phumzile Ncuka, Mlambo Ncuka, the former deputy president, became deputy president when he wasn't deputy president of the ANC. So I think people forget that history. The reality is that the president can appoint anybody.
Sure, fair point. There's also a lot of pressure, though, on the president to really consider who he finally puts in his cabinet, given the many challenges. And let's face it, the widespread disillusionment that the government is currently facing because of, the struggles we've had in the past couple of years. I suppose if the president had your ear, if you were able to speak to the president, what kind of considerations would you reckon he has to make as we count down to this announcement finally being made?
Well, obviously, I think part of our, democracy in general is that there are certain constraints that limit what the president could do, or not limit, but constrain. Yeah, that would be a better language. Constrain the president. What happens in the party at times determines who he can appoint. But in fact, in terms of the Constitution, he could ignore all that and do what he's supposed to do as the president in terms of the Constitution. I think if you ask me, I would say, given the nature of the crisis we are facing in the country, you need the president to appoint cabinet ministers who can do the job and who have the capacity to do that job. I just read through the reports about local government, municipalities. There are so many municipalities that are dysfunctional, so many municipalities that are not able to deliver services to the people. And I think that must be brought to an end, because it's not about money. I'm now convinced it's not about money. It's about capacity and capability of people who are political leaders in those municipalities and who are also at the management level. And so we need a radical decision to be made to make sure people get basic services they should get. And you also need people who can actually execute that with integrity and make sure that you don't lose resources of the state going into other people's pockets rather than serve the people. And so I would expect that when the president does reshuffle his cabinet or fill vacancies, he will think hard about what needs to be done. If you go to the party level, the conference and the Lehota, there are very clear indications of what needs to be done. And they have declared in January 8 that this year is a year of decisive action to meet the interests of the people and renewal of the organization, so that you don't have the organization that is self-serving, that serve the interests of individuals and families and personalities. This is the state, and the state must serve the people of South Africa, especially the most vulnerable.
Without a doubt, from your lips to the president's ears, we really hope. Reverend Frank Chikane, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. Appreciate your time and insights this Tuesday. Reverend Chikane, of course, is the former Director General in the presidency. Once again, thanks very much indeed.